Welcome to Earth, a Love Story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. On this episode of the podcast, I speak with Perdita Finn. Perdita is the co-founder, with her husband Clark Strand, of the feral fellowship The Way of the Rose, which inspired their book, The Way of the Rose, The Radical Path of the Divine Feminine Hidden in the Rosary. They are currently at work on their next book together, Circles Not Lines, Spiritual Community Beyond Patriarchy. To find out more about her devotion to ecology, not theology, visit wayoftherose.org. In addition to extensive study with Zen masters, priests, spirit workers, and healers, she apprenticed with the psychic Susan Saxman, with whom she wrote The Reluctant Psychic. Perdita Finn now teaches popular workshops on getting to know the dead. Participants are empowered to activate the miracles in their own lives with the help of their ancestors and recover their own intuitive magic. Her book, Take Back the Magic: Conversations with the Unseen World, is an intimate journey through her recovery of these lost ways. She speaks widely on how to collaborate with those on the other side, on the urgent necessity of a new romantic animism, and on the sobriety that emerges when we claim the long story of our souls. Her next book is The Body of My Mother. Entering into this conversation with Perdita felt like entering into a sacred space. I noted the candles and the pictures of ancestors that adorned the shelves behind her. And when I prepare to record podcasts with guests, I always say a prayer that it be helpful, that it be nourishing, that what we create together serve the world and serve all beings. This time I spontaneously said that prayer with Perdita, and as we settled into the conversation, it felt like the dead joined us, murmuring and whispering and rejoicing in this conversation with them at the center. Perdita's easy warmth and wisdom guided us through this other world so deftly that the hour flew by in what felt like a matter of moments. When our conversation ended, it felt like leaving the presence of a longtime friend who I immediately missed. In a state of overflowing gratitude, I stood up and walked to my altar, found the very last of my rose incense, and lit it and a candle to honor our time together and to honor all of the dead, all of our mothers and teachers and loved ones who are always with us, who hold the wisdom and strength that we will need as we navigate this time of the arrival of the fruits of denying death on our planet. I felt them all celebrating, and I felt utterly humbled by the web that holds us all. Take back the magic, indeed. Please enjoy this conversation with Perdita Finn. I reached out to you because I read your book, and I'd like to tell you kind of a story about how it came to me, because it was the magic for sure. So I first had a friend reach out to me who is a friend who kind of gets hits about things, but doesn't ever want to kind of push or intrude. So she kept sort of resisting and finally said, well, I'm just going to tell Robin about that. She really, really needs to read this book. And so that put it on my radar. I really pay attention when she says things like that. And then over the course of the next maybe 3 or 4 days, 3 other people reached out to me and said, you really need to read this book. And so I said, okay.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, it really came to me. And as I was reading it, it was one of those books that an alchemical process started to happen. I had a lot of synchronicities. I had dreams arise, and ultimately a very cool experience that happened in the world that would not have happened had I not read your book, that I'm happy to share with you. I want to save that a little bit because it was such a big culmination moment, but we can definitely talk about it. So that's why I reached out. It was a profound book to me. I shared it immediately with my mother. It caused her to make changes in the way that she was, she has a little altar for her mom, and she added her father to the altar. Like it just touched us. So I'm so grateful that you're here and willing to talk.
Thank you so much, Robin. And, I feel like I have a team on the other side who's my marketing team. So I feel like they're figuring out how to get it into people's hands.
Love it.
And I'm sure your father had a little something to do with that.
Yeah. My mom's dad, I imagine. So yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'd love for you to share kind of your story and how you came to have these conversations with the unseen. I know it's a big question, a big story, probably goes back a long way, but anything you'd like to share about kind of your personal journey would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, my book, Take Back the Magic, is one attempt to tell that story and to tell the story. We're all having conversations with the other side. Definitely we're having them in our dreams, right? Last night I had a dream, I'll tell you. And in it, I'm with my daughter in a room, and we are Airbnb-ing our room from someone who lives in the room downstairs, a young man who I can almost see. And we come down to thank him for the room. And as we come downstairs, I realize he's my son. Mm-hmm. And I think, isn't that strange? I didn't give birth to him in this life, but he's still my son. And I woke up from that dream and I thought, oh, there's someone who is my son in another life who's about to show up. And I have to be prepared for that. And I have learned to listen to my dreams as conversations with the dead. And I have felt nothing but affection and delight in this dream for this young man. And then I thought, oh, okay, that's how you can have a son you didn't give birth to in his life, and you can forget about him. But we're all forgetting about each other's relationships from the land of the dead. 13 years ago, in a time of tremendous crisis, met a woman, a psychic, a very powerful psychic. I wrote a book with her called The Reluctant Psychic. And she is an astounding oracle. As a child, she had to train herself to tell the living and the dead apart. And my experience when I went to her was that the dead were real. And I had been in conversation with the dead, and I'd been cultivating a relationship with them and cultivating my spiritual experiences with them. But she gave me a confirmation that what I was doing was real. And I suppose that my work is about trying to empower other people to trust the conversations they're already having with the dead. I tell a story about my mother, who was an atheist, a bohemian, modern lady. And one night coming into her bedroom and realizing there was a whole wall with nothing but pictures of the dead, and that she muttered to them and talked to them all the time. She had an ancestor altar. She didn't call it an ancestor altar. If you had asked her what she was doing, she would have said, I'm talking to myself. But in fact, when she was dying, all those ancestors showed up to be with her.
Yeah, really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm familiar with that turn from communicating with the unseen world and feeling the aliveness of it, but needing to compartmentalize it and push it away and separate it. And then there comes a moment when there's something that happens where the toothpaste cannot be put back in the tube.
Exactly. And it used to be, it used to be a ubiquitous experience for all people. That was what guidance was. I often say that the opposite of God is not goddess, but everything. That our ancestors experience the animate aliveness of the world, that the dead and the living were always changing places, and we're all available to each other for different perspectives. And one of the reasons I love a conversation is when there's always the living offer different perspectives and the dead offer a really different perspective. Part of my work is to try to see with the eyes of the dead while I'm still alive.
Oh, that's absolutely beautiful. That really came through for me in your book. The holiness of death is a huge thing for me. It's what makes us alive, is the fact that there is a death. And as you express it in your book, that we're living among the dead. We're walking on the dead. We're walking with the dead, that it's as close as breath. Really, really came through with your book. And I also love the very grounded way in which you coach people to interact with the dead. It's not something that we already don't know how to do on some level.
All of this is you can do on your own. People often ask, sometimes people have asked me, what are your credentials? Where's your diploma? What program have you mastered the various steps of? And I say, well, I've been talking to the dead for a number of decades, and they've been my teachers. And you can really trust the dead to be your teachers. They're not going to steal your money. They're not going to try and sleep with you. They're not going to tell you to abandon your family. They're going to be pretty careful and loving with you. I often say I'm very frightened of the living, but I'm not very frightened of the dead. And in fact, civilization has been a 10,000-year experiment to get us to forget about our relationship with the dead and to be frightened of them and to not seek their guidance. So we listen to and obey authorities of all kinds. And it's very radical and powerful. It can take an act of courage to begin to reclaim these conversations in a culture that once burned women for doing that. And certainly will label them crazy or wacky, right? We don't burn women anymore, talk to the dead, but we often medicate them.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm curious if you can talk about, part of my history is having contact with the unseen world, including the dead, but also other aspects of the unseen world. And for many years, there was absolute terror. And I think that part of that was that even though I had this really amazing childhood closely connected to nature and a really safe and loving family, they're just, as you said, it has been exiled from our culture. There's not a place for it. And so it was a journey that I took to kind of parse out what was safe, what wasn't, where I needed to put up boundary, where I didn't. And I've even felt with some ancestors, like some of my own dead relations, that if they were problematic in life, it may be difficult to have a relationship with them after death. And I wonder if you can talk about your feelings on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about it. Sometimes I say that how do we think about life and death? And the ancient goddesses were always weavers, right? Spinners, they're spiders. And I used to love to do embroidery as a child. And I often invite people to imagine the soul as a thread, a gold thread, a red thread, a green thread. And imagine that thread coming up through the cloth and then going back down as a stitch is made. And then it comes back up and then it goes back down. And each stitch is a life. But we don't see the big picture from a single stitch of our own souls and our own soul's journey. And we also often see as the living the picture from the wrong side, right? We see the jumble, the mess. If you look at embroidery from the wrong side, it just looks like a jumble, knots, frayed threads, mess. But if you look at it from the other side, picture emerges. And I think that when we die, we get to glimpse the picture from the other side. We get to see the long story of our own souls. We get to realize the ways, and I often talk about rebirth and renewal. I believe that we don't have just one life to get it right. I believe that there's not one stitch made with that thread, but thousands and millions of stitches, all entangled with other threads. And what happens when we see the big picture and the long story of our souls? What happens to the person who denies? And most civilized people are living in denial of that long story. To be a civilized human being is to live in denial of the long story. And I think when we die, we get to, that's why I say I want to see with the eyes of the dead when I'm alive. I want to know that the man I meet, maybe at the health food store, maybe at the party I'm going to tonight, has been my son in another life who showed up in my dream last night. And to acknowledge the mystery of that connection and that intimacy. What happens when we begin to realize that every soul we meet has been our child? So that when we are dropping bombs on another country, we're dropping them on our own children. when we're cutting down a forest and clear cutting it, we're cutting down our own mothers and grandmothers. What happens when we live with that kind of radical intimacy in the world? And I think when we claim the long story of our souls, we begin to live with that kind of radical intimacy. So how does that affect our difficult ancestors, the monsters in life? My psychic friend often says that the first thing a lot of people say when they die is, oh shit, they hadn't got it. They missed the point. And they'd been living like nothing mattered, nothing mattered. It turned out everything mattered. And everyone mattered. Every soul mattered. Every being mattered. Every creature mattered. And so I think a lot of souls, when they pass through, human souls, not animal souls or plant souls, but human souls, there's this feeling of, I need to make amends. I screwed up. And we can give them opportunities to make amends. Now, I do a lot of teaching about this, Robin, and this is not an easy journey, and this is something I work with people in very, very deep ways, but I don't think we have to offer the dead our forgiveness. But I do think we can offer the dead an opportunity to engage our forgiveness. And my book is about my rage at my father after he died and how he began showing up in my life. So I'm going to tell you a story this has just happened. I've written this story about healing with my father and the miracles he brought through for me and all the ways we healed after he died, right? This impossible man, this impossible being, and I have found a way to love each other. But there's still a piece of me that's not sure about it, because I have a dream one night, and in it, my parents show up. I'm in a field, and they said to me, we would like to be your parents again. And I said, oh, really? I don't know. I mean, like, cool with you guys. I'm happy to be your mother, but you guys as my parents again? Really? And I woke up. I thought, wow, there's still a place in me that's angry at them. And a piece of me that was angry at them was about how they had treated my sister, which I do not write about in my book. I had set each of them, my sister the year before had ended up on dialysis, and I had set each of them on my sister's kidneys, which were failing. And it hadn't mattered. She'd ended up in full kidney failure and on dialysis. The day after this dream, I went to my parents and I said, I think I don't trust you to be my parents again. And I don't know what you would have to do to make it up to me, but something. And I got a phone call from my sister. She is one in a million patients who has just been taken off dialysis because her kidneys have fully healed. And I looked at my parents, they're there up on my altar, and I said, okay, you win. You get the job. You want to be my parents in my next life. You can be my parents. And we're all growing. We're all changing. We're all making amends. And I've seen this happen again and again and again. You know what I mean? I've seen people who were really angry. I once sat down with a woman who had been abused as a young child by two of her cousins, terribly. And they were now dead. And we sat down, and she'd carried this weight for a long time. And we sat down and we made a list of 10 impossible things these two men would have to do in order for them to be forgiven by her. I mean, really impossible thing. I said, let's make it hard. These guys aren't getting off easy. You know what I mean? And if she had to pass that down to her descendants to say, these two monsters have got amends to make in our family. And you want to add to the list, you get to add to the list. You know what I mean? They've got a lot of work to do. By the end of the week, they'd done 4 of them. And she was so you know what I mean? Mother Teresa once said, I'm no fan of Mother Teresa, by the way. She was, no living are saints, by the way. Living are complicated messes of human beings. And she was certainly a complicated mess of a human being. But someone once asked her, why do you do what you do? Why do you try to help the poor? Why are you such a giving person? And she said, because I have Hitler inside me. Mm. And there was some part of her that knew that the life she was living was making amends for another life she'd had, not necessarily Hitler, but, there is an acknowledgement that we all have past lives. We don't know what we've done to each other. And we've all hurt other beings in ways we don't even know. And so may I be given an opportunity when I pass over to make amends, when I can see with the eyes of the dead.
So, so beautiful. Where that lives in my kind of cosmology and how I speak about that is that love is like is our best move. Love and compassion, it's the best move that we have. It's the thing.
It is.
Trumps everything.
And it's the only thing that's real. Mm-hmm. Only hearts are real. Minds, we don't even know what minds are. You know what I mean? They don't live in our brains. They might live in our stomach. They're probably in our feet. But hearts are real. And love is real. I remember my mother had dementia at the end of her life. And she lived with me. And one morning, she came up to me and she touched me on the cheek. And she said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm your daughter." And she said, "Oh, I knew there was a reason I loved you so much." And it was fantastic. It was one of the great moments with her. I don't just remember my name. None of us have to remember each other's names. We have to remember that we love each other and that we've all been each other's daughters.
Right. I was having this conversation yesterday in a slightly different way, talking about something my teacher told me, which is that to offer devotion as if every single person that we come across, every being that we come across has been our mother, and realizing that we've all been each other's mothers over and over and over again. Yeah.
That's it. And to have a lived experience of that. And how do we have a lived experience of that? I mean, that can live as an idea in our head. And one of the things that I try to work with people is to have a very intimate, very specific, engaged relationship with those on the other side. So you can actually experience them as mothers showing up for you. No one in our culture gets enough mothering, and that is by the design, by the way. Mm-hmm. In Indigenous culture, no one is mothered by one person. They're mothered by a clan of mothers and of men and women who experience mothering as a communal activity. There are even stories of people not knowing who their biological mother was, that you might be nursed by 5 or 6 different people in the community. You might, you experience yourself being held and cared for. And we don't get enough mothering. We don't even have much of an experience of it. And so, actually, my next book is all about this. What would it feel like to be able to have enough mother? And I think we can relate to the world as a mother when we feel mothered and cared for. So, and I often tell people, start really small. It may be that you're just hitting your head against the wall with some bureaucratic hellhole of our modern world, and you call upon someone from the other side. I often call him my father's secretary because he was fabulous with those kinds of things. And when help arrives, miraculously as it often does, it's so amazing. I do this 2 moon cycle prayer period that I do. It's called the 54-day novena. I call it 2 moons, 1 prayer. And I always assign someone from the other side to be my guide during that time. And this novena, which covers my birthday and the new year, I am praying for a jubilee year, a resetting of all karmic debts. Big ask, right? Like a jubilee year was in ancient Judaism, a year when all debts were forgiven. Slaves were freed, land was let to go fallow, anybody who had debt to anybody else forgiven. In fact, it was what Yeshua was invoking with his prayer when he said, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who debt against us." He was calling forth a jubilee year, and that the great karmic reset. So I'm praying for a great karmic reset. I thought, who's going to be my guardian from the other side for this? I don't don't know, I'm thinking it's going to be a grandparent or some big. Well, there was this little old man who was our neighbor when I was a child. You know, he was one of those guys who wore his trouser pants like up to his armpits. You know, he was very old and he was very funny and he was a little out of it. He was kind. He was a benign presence, but he always used to tell these long, impossible to follow stories, like endless stories that you couldn't make any sense of. And they would always end with like, and Tiff knew Buffy, who knew Skippy, who of course knew Dave, who went to Williams. And it was like a joke in our family. We'd say, like, who went to Williams? That's always the punchline of every story. And then, of course, the great punchline was, I went to Williams. Right? Anyway, I decided to call on him for help because he'd been a banker. And I thought, who better to forgive karmic debts than a banker? The day I began the novena, I was forgiven a debt I'd forgotten I had. In the mail, it came an announcement about it. It said, you've been freed of this debt. And then a friend of mine from high school I hadn't heard from in 45 years wrote to me to ask my forgiveness for behavior. It's astounding.
Mm-hmm.
Do I feel mothered by this little old man who went to Williams? You better believe it.
Right.
Mothering isn't an abstract idea. It's this very specific, intimate care. Really, really profound.
Thank you for all of these also very intimate stories with these details. Thank you for that. Thank you for telling the stories of your life in this way. It's really beautiful.
Well, thank you for acknowledging that. You know, I'm kind of naked and out there these days.
Yeah. Same. I hear you. Yeah. You know, what this is calling me to, one of the things is Frances Weller's book, this beautiful book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Are you familiar?
Oh my gosh. But it's a beautiful title.
It is. It's so beautiful. It's about grief. Grief is definitely a big part of my work. And as you're talking about how we lived as humans for such a long time, being mothered and cared for by the entire village, I'm thinking of Francis Weller. He talks about the 5 gateways of grief. And one of them is the things that we expected but did not receive. And that is what he's talking about, that we expected to arrive in a village. We expected to arrive in a community. And so I would like to ask you broadly about grief, since you work so closely with the dead. And to me, that also leads us directly to the goddess, who I really want to talk to you about as well. So that's my setup.
Well, let me talk about grief and the sorrowful mother. And, you know, we're the only animals who live who live inside of abjection. And my great grief, you know, there's the grief at the passage of someone we love to the other side, of course, right? Like, my mother has been dead now for 21 years. What I wouldn't do to be able to pick up the phone and call her or just reach out and hold her, right? Mm-hmm. There's always that hurt, right? Like, I feel her intimately beside me, but I want her body back. You know, we love people, and love is a dance that includes, you know, joy and sorrow. We're coming and going all the time. My husband and I, you know, there's just not enough time to love each other. We've been married 30 years and one of us is going to die first. And our prayer is to find each other as teenagers the next time around. You know? Can we do it?
Have some more time.
More time. And when we love people, you want more time, right? I sign up. I want to, you know, my parents asked to be my parents again. We love you. I want to find everyone I love again. And yet it's like one of those country dances where we're always coming and going, right? And that's a natural grief. That is the natural grief of beings incarnating, dancing through life and death. Nature is change. Nature is not nostalgic. Nature is always making new things out of old things. Things die so new things can be made. That grief is part of the dance. And it has a sweetness to it. But there's another kind of grief. And that is the grief and the horror at what we've done to each other as human beings. And that is an unnatural grief. And that is, we are the only species that makes each other homeless. We're the only species that, dies in our own filth and addiction. We're the only species that bombs each other, right? And murders each other and creates serial killers. And what is going on with us? What's the matter with us? People sometimes say, I want to call forth our humanity. I'm like, oh my God, no, I'd rather be a bobcat than a human being. You know what I mean? Bobcats are a hell of a lot nicer than human beings. Call forth my inner bobcat. But my grief at what we do to each other and what we're doing to every other being on this planet. We're in the middle of the 6th extinction of all life on this planet, and we are the cause of it. That's a grief that is profound. I work with what people experience as the Christian mysteries, but I'm not Christian at all. I'm not even interested in any religion. But those mysteries are related to the mystery traditions of the Mediterranean. And they remind us of the sorrows of empire. And I pray for an end to those sorrows and those griefs. I pray for an end to civilization. And I pray for the guidance of the dead to guide us through the collapse of that catastrophe. So those are 2 kinds of grief that I hold. And I pray to the mothers to hold us through that.
Yeah, in my connection to the unseen world, the unseen beings that I'm in connection with told me to write this book. And I was just like, I think that's the craziest thing. I can't believe I'm being told to do this. And one of the things that, as I was writing, I realized was that I had sort of a similar idea, and the way that I phrase it is that there's a natural suffering that makes sense, that is woven into who we are on the planet. It's loss and it's birth and death and all of that. And then there's a dumb suffering that that is not necessary and that we do to each other. And that is the thing that truly shatters us. On some level, we know, even if it's deep, deep in our bones and our culture doesn't really hold it anymore, we know how to be with the grief of loss of a loved one. Even if, I almost hate to say that, because I'm thinking of people who are suffering with that loss and don't have the village around them, don't have community around them, which is what it used to be. We would bear this all together, and we have sort of forgotten how to do that. But deep in us, we remember how to do that. This other kind of suffering is something else. And one thing that I loved in your book and that I immediately integrated is this idea that it is our contact with the unseen world, with the dead and with these other beings, that can help us move through this time of the meta crisis and emerge. If we can integrate their wisdom, as you said, they're not going to take our money. They're not going to do these other things. They have a completely different perspective. They can see from the other side of the cloth and can give us a different idea of how to move through these crises. That made me really hopeful.
Yeah, they've done climate change.
Mm-hmm.
They did the Bronze Age collapse. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, we've seen it. Yeah, we remember that day. There was a day when half of the Mediterranean was ocean and half of it wasn't. And on a single day, the earth shifted and walls of water a mile high poured into the other half of the Mediterranean. Mm. Okay? So as I said, like, we remember that day. We can get you through stuff. We did that, we can do this. And that's the thing that's also hopeful to remember about death with our ancestors. One of my very favorite books, I talk about it a lot, is Tyson Yunkaporta's Sand Talk. Do you know it?
I don't. Mm-mm.
He's a Aboriginal teacher, and it's a beautiful book. And, he says in his culture, your great-grandmother dies and is reborn as your child, and you know that. And in that world that you're going to be reborn into, you behave very, very differently. I had a moment with my father really profoundly recently. And suddenly I found myself praying for, he'd be 13 now, praying for that little boy to feel my love, blessed wherever he was, held, just loved. But the dead will guide us. The dead know how to do climate change. They know how to do species collapse. They've done 5 other planetary extinctions. It's nothing new.
Right.
You think this is bad?
Right.
Let me tell you about the 30,000 years it rained glass after the meteor struck. Really, everything dies. Every single thing dies. Stars die, planets die, trees die. And it's not a mistake and it's not a failure. You see these kind of techno narcissists today saying, we're going to figure out a way to live forever. And they also want to stay up forever. They don't want to sleep. I love to sleep. And somebody seems to leave one life too early or too soon, but we don't know what life they're arriving on time for. My prayer is to find my husband again as a teenager. So I don't know what that's going to look like. How does that play out? We found each other in this life. And we have the experience of having been together before. Everyone in my family does, which is a lovely feeling.
Yeah. I'm so transported, I have to say. I'm just like in this sort of spell space with you. And it's such a nourishing, beautiful conversation just to have this as the ground, just that we are so interconnected. My journey brought me to the long self. I didn't have that as a point of awareness until I went through this journey, until I came back to where I grew up, back to the land where I grew up, back to living close to my parents. I call us a village of 3. We're living in this.
Where do you live?
I live in southern Colorado, middle of nowhere. I grew up in a dome, a geodesic dome that they built. They were back to the lander hippies, grew up off grid. And I left and went into the world because that's what people do. So I've moved 32 times. I just went looking. And finally, after a great grief in my life, which was just the death of a timeline, the death of a relationship that I had poured a lot of my life into. So after the death of that, all of a sudden on the other side of that threshold, I realized that whatever wealth is, whatever abundance is, it exists in this land that raised me and with these people that I will miss when they're gone and that will be dead. And so I came and built a little dome on the other side of the valley. And it's, the world, I had to work with some kind of internalized shame about like, oh, you're going back home, you're going back to live with parents. And so I worked through that because the world says we're not supposed to do that. But my long self knows this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And that I can go, any of us really can, those of us who have the privilege to can go anywhere in the world, kind of live anywhere that you want. I like I said, I moved 32 times. Now all I want is to learn this space, like this spot, this forest right behind me, this land, these people. It's the most, I couldn't imagine being more wealthy, having more abundance than just that.
Well, first of all, I just want to shout yes, yes, yes. I often say the most radical act of defiance in this culture is for mothers and daughters to refuse to be separated from each other and to understand their solidarity of kin. And we have forgotten the power of drawing kin close and that it really matters, right? It really, really matters to feel close. Yeah, I, like you, thought I had to go off, right? I had to be separate. My daughter lives 5 minutes from me. My son is getting ready to move home to our area and feeling like, like, is this a shame? Is this defeat? But he wants to be home with his family and to know what that means and the wealth of that and the tradition of that is really important, and to be rooted in land. The Surgeon General in America recently said that the greatest disease in America right now that's killing more people than any drug, than any substance, is loneliness.
Right. That's what I needed, a family. I needed a family.
Of course. We all need family.
And when I did, it situated me in my long self. I became aware of the long story. It just going one generation back, just beginning to thread that lineage, because I don't have children. So but beginning to connect to a lineage was.
You don't have children in this life.
In this life, right. That's right. Yeah.
Sometimes we need a break.
Right. Thank you. I will take that. Yeah.
My grandmother had 6 children. I think in this life she may have,
right.
Thank God for birth control.
Right. Yes. Yes. I will take that. So talk to me, if you would, about the goddess, because one of my experiences with your book that was completely unexpected was her arrival. And I have to say, I don't think that you can see it, but in this dome, one of the things that happened was that I got a lot of communication about the symbols that are placed here and that are part of this. And one of them is the rose. So if you'd like to talk about the goddess, and I know you do work called the Way of the Rose. I don't know exactly what that work entails, but anything you'd like to share about that would be very welcome.
Well, my husband and I wrote a book together called The Way of the Rose, The Radical Path of the Divine Feminine, hidden in the Rosary. And that book is about our recovery of the Rosary as a pre-Christian, pre-religious spiritual devotion to the Mother. And in fact, beads have been found that are over 100,000 years old. They're one of the oldest objects people have ever made. And making a bead is a lot of work. It's not like an easy thing to do. If you make a bead out of stone or shell, it takes a lot of care to do it and to get it to be threaded. And it wasn't just clearly for adornment. If anyone who's listening has a button or a bead they can hold on to and roll it between your fingers and notice how it makes you feel just for a minute. And even if you don't have anything, just imagine rolling a bead between your index finger and your thumb. You may begin to notice your whole body shifting. And do you know why that is? Do you know why that gesture is so supremely comforting?
I do not, but I feel it. As you described it, I began doing that with my empty fingers and my whole body relaxed. So I would love to hear.
Your whole body relaxed. It is one of the oldest spiritual gestures in the world because it is the spiritual gesture of the primate, of the ape. It is what we do with our fingers. We reach out for our mother's nipple and we rub it between our fingers and the milk flows into our mouths. And so when human beings were in crisis or anxious, the thing that made them feel better was to hold on to the nipple. And they began making beads. So 70,000 years ago, when Mount Toba erupted and plunged the whole world into a climactic winter, and 5,000 Homo sapiens were left on the planet in the Horn of Africa, what did they do? They made beads to comfort themselves. And so beads are used in every religious tradition around the world for prayer, because that gesture of prayer is the desire to rub that bead and feel the sweetness and the nourishment and the warmth of that milk, that Milky Way, descending into us and feeding our spiritual hearts. And so the Rosary is a very old spiritual tradition. And my husband and my book, The Way of the Rose, is about that spiritual tradition. We founded a spiritual community called The Way of the Rose that's really radical. And my husband and I have been really interested in spiritual community for a long time. And this will sort of weave around into the goddess a little bit. And one of the things a question we've been asking for a long time is, what do people need spiritually to be able to navigate climate change? We've been asking that for 35 years. And we didn't see any answers because most of the world's religions arose out of patriarchal traditions that were very old indeed at that point. And you know what I'm saying? So they're very much part of the problem. And what is the solution and what is the answer? Our next book is called Circles Not Lines, Spiritual Community Beyond Patriarchy. And what does it mean to learn to gather in communities that are circles. And I look at your dome there, and not hierarchies of domination, and not systems of domination. And so the community we founded, the Way of the Rose Circles we founded, their basic principles are that we gather as friends to support each other in praying the rosary for our heart's desire and supporting others to do so. But we have no expert teachers, masters, or gurus. Everybody of any, everybody's got their own long story. So God knows, you know what I mean? Or God knows. There are no levels. There are no priests or priestesses. Priestesses are as much a problem as priests are. That's a patriarchal hell realm. And friends, mothers, children, community, circles of community. Everything involved in our community is free. Nothing costs anything. It's 100% free. And we sponsor circles around the world. They're all free. We have, thousands of members all over the world. We have the Rose Circles in Alexandria, Egypt, and France, England, all over America. They're all free. They're all just circles of friends. My husband and I have studied non-hierarchical spiritual communities, from 12-step groups to a lay Buddhist group that sort of fascinated us, to even the early Christian communities, of very early Christian communities before they got taken over, to think about how do you safeguard these circles and how do you safeguard community. So that is my Way of the Rose community, which is in devotion. We say to the mother by any name you want to call her.
Mm-hmm.
Any name. And we have people who grew up Jewish or Buddhist, or we have Zen masters, we have priests, we have all kinds of religious traditions all coming together to pray to the mother in devotion for their heart's desire. So that's our Way of the Rose community. wayoftherose.org. You can find out more about us.
Amazing.
We're quite anarchic.
Mm-hmm.
And we allow no advertising of any kind or self-promotion, and nothing that costs any money. And so there are many, everybody's got a new program they want to sell their workshop or whatever, and we don't allow any of it.
Yeah, beautiful. I can't wait to check it out. It sounds wonderful.
On the side, it's very simple and very ordinary. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of spiritual performance. There's no performance art. It's just people like, I was in a circle last night. There's an old lady who's a Catholic lady who still goes to mass, but has found our group because her children are gay and she wants to, do you know what I mean? And she's got to find other people to pray with. And then there is a non-binary person who's you know what I mean? And then we have young and old and all in between, and everybody coming together. And the only thing we're doing is asking the question, what do I want? Truly, madly, and deeply. Mm. Do we want this ecocidal culture, or do we want something else? Do we want family and love and kinship and rootedness and belonging? And we have lots of miracle stories in our group.
Oh, I imagine. I imagine that is true. Yes. I'll tell you the unexpected path that emerged as I was reading your book that has to do with the goddess. So again, I was reading your book and had the experience several times of having already read it. And I was very confused. I thought, did I skip ahead 30 pages? Like it kept happening over and over. And finally I surrendered to it and said, something's happening here. I'm just going to be with it.
You know about time loops?
Yes, Eric Wargos and his.
Oh my gosh, you know that? Isn't that the best book?
Yes, it is. I do. I love Eric Wargos' work. Right? It's again the long self. And that was my experience, which was very strange. I have stacks of books that are begging for my attention, and as soon as I got yours, I just went through it. It was just with me, and I don't know why, but the last thing I expected was the arrival of the goddess, of the mother. And what had been happening, she's part of my practice. She's part of my devotional practice, and I'm very closely connected. But as I was reading your book, before I got to that part, I had a dream where my family went to visit. I grew up I'm in Southern Colorado. I'm in the Southwest. And there's a tradition of bathtub Virgin of
I
Guadalupe
know, I love them.
statues. Yes, I do too. I do too. I love them very much. I'm just driving into our little town. There's two on the way, and I always look over at them. And so in this dream, my whole family was myself, my parents, and my sister were traveling to visit a shrine to the goddess and sort of learn about how to do it, because we needed to create our own shrine. And when we got there, it was this mix of sort of a shrine to the mother mixed with an orno, which is a kind of a mud oven that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So my folks built one when I was a kid, and you light a fire in the back and then let the coals burn down and cook bread in it and things like that.
Beautiful.
And so on this orno, there were these massive tortillas that were being cooked. And in the dream, I picked one up and tore off a piece and ate it. And I don't know if I've ever had this experience, but I could taste it. It was salty and sort of charred, and it was just
sounds fabulous.
Yeah, yes, it was so wonderful. And we were sort of learning about it. And then I was shown that we needed to do this on our land. We needed to put a representation of the goddess on the land so that we could visit her and leave offerings, and that other people could do it. And it was both this beautiful dream and this connection to the land and place, and also very clearly a directive. Right. And so I had that dream, and then a day or two later started reading the end of your book. And the just full body chill synchronicity. I don't want to say exactly all of it so that it won't spoil it for people who are going to read it. But the other thing that happened is that, as I was just sort of watching this in amazement, watching all of this unfold, the other thing that happened is that you talked about the cloisters in New York. And I live in the middle of nowhere. I'm very much a homebody, but it just so happened that I was going to an event in New York like the next week. And I'd never heard of the cloisters. I looked it up. The event was taking place literally a 10-minute walk from where I was going to be. And so I was like, oh my God, I have to go to the cloisters. And I don't know what this is about. But so I went there because of you, I read your book, and because.
Did you go say hi to the ladies there?
I did, absolutely. And I thought of you, and I looked into each of their faces with love. It was so beautiful. And then experienced this kind of miracle there that was just amazing. So
can you share your miracle?
It's actually a secret.
I understand that.
Yeah. Kind of how I felt with your book. I felt like you were telling me a secret, and it had to do with the mother, and it had to do with the goddess. And then it played out in my life in this really beautiful way. So that's my experience of that part of your book. And thank you for that.
She showed up in our lives, and it was really, my husband has written about it in his book, Waking Up to the Dark, and we wrote about it together in The Way of the Rose. And we sort of say that these books are a trilogy of trying to metabolize this experience of her showing up in our lives. But, she is the earth, the land, and to make a shrine on your land to her is just to acknowledge that she's there, right? Mm-hmm. I live in the Northeast, and so much, the indigenous presence was so radically obliterated in the Northeast of America. And I love to go to the Southwest because you still feel that devotion to the land, right? Mm-hmm. But we need to resurrect it everywhere.
Right.
There's this couple on the Thruway in Massachusetts who created a shrine to Our Lady, and people started stopping and leaving roses, We want to be devoted to her. We want to remember that we have a mother, that we have enough mothers in the world. And we want to know that she's really there. Sometimes people mock, my father would have been one of these people, I actually have a great story about my father in this. I don't tell in the book. He loved, people who see, the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast or a piece of tree. But the point is, she isn't a piece of toast. Right. She's the ones who are eating her body when you eat the toast. Of course, she's going to show up in a piece of toast. Of course, she is the tree. She's everywhere.
Yeah. Something that just as I was realizing as I was reading your book about the dead, that they are with us and they're everywhere. And it sort of takes an unveiling of our own ideas and our own kind of armoredness and guardedness and our own numbed and kind of deadened parts that we've had to adopt just to survive the world as it is. And when those things start coming back to life, then we see everything.
We're not doing a very good at surviving. And one of the things that can be a great place to start with the dead is, I often say, you don't have to believe anything.
Mm-hmm.
Give yourself an experience that transforms your understanding of the belief sphere. So ask for help. Start small. I had a woman in a class of mine, and I told everyone to ask for help, but start really small and practical, so it didn't feel too scary. And she needed wood chips for her garden, and apparently all the wood chips were out at the local garden supply store, and she couldn't find wood chips. And there was a drought, and her trees were drying. And she said, so she had this old uncle, Nino, and she said, Nino, get me some wood chips. That's easy. And she put his picture out on the altar, said this, and walked into the other room, and she heard a noise, and she looked out the window, and there was a truck backing into her neighbor's driveway, piled high with wood chips. And she ran outside, and she said, what are you doing? He said, delivering wood chips to your neighbor. She said, do you have any extra? He said, sure. Can you pay me now? She said, yes. And it was that instantaneous. And the look on her face was, ask for something small that you really need, and watch how, the classic, of course, is people ask for a parking space, oh my God, help me find a parking space in New York, help me get a human being on the phone, help the test be negative. And I think that when we build a foundation of faith by asking for help, but we've been trained in our culture not to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's what makes us feel so desperate and lonely and hopeless.
Have the miracles become ordinary yet?
Oh, they never become ordinary. I can't believe it. I mean, my sister getting off dialysis? Really? That's, I'm stunned, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can't believe it. Every night I hear people's miracles, and I just can't believe it. I'm always like, oh my gosh, this is real. Getting a letter in the mail that I had a lien against my house for a debt, and it's been removed the moment I asked for it to be removed. I mean, I'm getting that email from a high school friend out of the blue. But we have to ask. And, I often say that working with the dead is as easy as making bread, thinking of those tortillas. You just mix up, your cornmeal or your flour and your water and spread it out on the stone, and there you go. But there's an art to it, right? And there's a sense of timing, and you have to know how to get the stones to the right heat. And so we do need friends to help us learn how to pray again. We've lost the culture of prayer. And we do need to learn how to speak the language of the dead and understand the timing of the dead, right? This journey began by asking, my daughter was really sick, and the doctors couldn't tell us what was the matter. And we had spent all our money trying to get her better. We had no more money left, and we lost our jobs. And that's when we began to rely on prayer. But my daughter's not better yet. My daughter has an incurable genetic illness. And we have learned a lot about prayer, navigating this illness as a family. I am still praying for a miracle of healing for her. And 13 years later, I'm still praying, and I'm not going to stop. Some prayers are not answered in a life. Some prayers are answered in another life. And I have to know that too.
Beautiful. Thank you. I sort of want to land there. Such a beautiful place to land. Yeah, I want to thank you for helping to re-enchant the world, to re-enchant the animate world, and help us all remember. Thank you so much for your time today, and for writing this beautiful book, and for your work in the world. I feel like I'm sitting with a wise woman, and it's just been so nourishing. Thank you. Well,
I feel like I'm sitting with a wise woman, and I can feel us sitting in that circle together. And I hope we can gather circles of wise men and women together. We're going to need them all sitting together,
Absolutely.
having these conversations.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Doing that work on my end. Doing it.
Tell.
Trying. Perdita, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you again to Perdita Finn for this beautiful conversation. Thank you to Morgan Jenks for our musical soundscapes. Thank you to the patrons who support this podcast and to all of the listeners. Thank you. For more information on my work or to book a one-on-one session with me, please visit honeyheart.org.